So today is chapter 10. Granddaddy did chapter 9. And our question for today is, will God forgive really bad people? Jesus, God's Son, was known for hanging out with a tough crowd. He made friends with people who drank too much alcohol. He talked with a woman people didn't like because she had been married to too many husbands. More than one is too many. He spent time with a tax collector who had cheated a lot of people out of a lot of money. So it's no surprise that God welcomes all people who admit their sin and accept his forgiveness no matter what they've done. Jesus said that his goal is to save people who know they need his help. No matter who we are or what we have done, he wants us to remember one truth. All of us have messed up, so all of us need forgiveness. And Romans 3:22 says, we are made right in God's sight when we trust in Jesus Christ to take away our sins. And we can all be saved in this same way, no matter who we are or what we have done. Okay, now we're going to start chapter 10. Goblin Councils. In the caverns beneath the mountain, Curdy was as watchful as ever, but was almost getting tired of his ill success. Every other night or so, he followed the goblins about as they went on digging and boring, and getting as near to them as he could, he would watch them from behind sticks and stones and rocks. He always kept hold of the end of his string, while his pickaxe, left just outside the hole by which he passed from the mine into the goblins' country, continued to serve as an anchor and hold fast the other end. One night, after dodging about and listening till he was nearly falling asleep with weariness, he began to roll up his ball, for he had resolved to go home to bed. But it wasn't long, however, before he began to feel puzzled, bewildered. One after another, he passed goblin caves occupied by goblin families, and at length he was sure there were many more than he had passed as he came. Could his string have led him wrong? He still followed, winding it, and still it led him into more thickly populated quarters until he became quite uneasy. For although he was not afraid of the goblins, he was afraid of not finding his way out. But what could he do? It wasn't any use to just sit down and wait for morning. The morning made no difference here. It was always dark here, and if his string failed him, he was helpless. He might even arrive within a yard of the mine and never know it. Well, seeing he could do nothing better, he decided to find where the end of his string was and how it had come to play him such a trick. He knew by the size of the ball that he was getting pretty near the last of it when he began to feel a tugging and pulling on his string. What could it mean? Turning a sharp corner, he thought he heard strange sounds. These grew as he went on to a scuffling and growling and squeaking. The noise increased until, turning a second sharp corner, he found himself in the midst of a wallowing mass, which he knew must be a knot of the cob's creatures. Before he could get up to his feet, he had caught some great scratches on his face and several severe bites on his legs and arms. But as he scrambled to get up, his hand fell upon his pickaxe, and before the horrid beast could do him any serious harm, he was swinging about with it right and left in the dark. Their hideous cries, the scampering and retreating howls, gave him the satisfaction of knowing that he had gotten rid of them. So he stood for a little, weighing his battle axe in his hand as if it had been the most precious lump of metal, then untied the end of his string from it and put the ball in his pocket, and still stood thinking. It was clear that the cob's creatures had found his axe, and had between them carried it off, and so led him he knew not where. But for all his thinking, he could not tell what he ought to do until he suddenly became aware of a glimmer of light in the distance. Without a moment's hesitation, he set out for the light as fast as the unknown and rugged way would permit. He came at length to a small chamber in which an opening high up in the wall revealed a glow beyond it. To this opening he managed to scramble up, and then he saw a strange sight. Below him sat a little group of goblins around a fire, the smoke of which vanished in the darkness far aloft, up high. The sides of the cave were full of shining minerals like those of the palace hall, and the company was evidently of a superior order of cobs, for everyone wore stones about their head or arms or waist, shining dull, gorgeous colors in the light of the fire. Nor had Curdie looked long before he recognized the king himself and found that he had made his way into the inner apartment of the royal family. He crept through the hole as softly as he could, scrambled a good way down the wall towards them without attracting attention, and then he sat down and listened. The king, evidently the queen, and probably the crown prince and the prime minister were talking all together. He was sure of the queen by her shoes, for as she warmed her feet at the fire, he saw them quite plainly. "That'll be fun," said the one he took for the crown prince. It was the first whole sentence he heard. "I don't see why you should think the marriage such a grand affair," said his stepmother, tossing her head backward. "You must remember, my spouse," interposed His Majesty, as if making excuses for his son. "He has got the same blood in him. His mother—" "Don't talk to me about his mother. You positively encourage his unnatural fancies. Whatever belongs to that mother ought to be cut out of him. If you expect me to approve of such coarse tastes, you will find yourself mistaken. I don't wear shoes for nothing." "But you must acknowledge, however," the king said with a little groan, "this is no whim of Harelip's, but it's a matter of state policy. You are well aware that his gratification comes purely from the pleasure of sacrificing himself to the public good. Does it not, Harelip?" "Yes, father, of course it does, only it will be nice to try to make her cry. I'll have the skin taken off between her toes, tie them up until they grow together, and then her feet will be like other people's, and there will be no occasion for her to wear shoes." "Do you mean to insinuate that I've got toes, you unnatural wretch?" cried the queen, and she moved angrily towards Harelip. The counselor, however, who was between them, leaned forward so as to prevent her touching him. "Your Royal Highness," he said to the prince, "possibly requires to be reminded that you have got 3 toes yourself, 1 on one foot, 2 on the other." "Ha, ha, ha!" shouted the queen triumphantly. The counselor, encouraged by this mark of favor, went on. "Well, it seems to me, your Royal Highness, it would greatly endear you to your future people if you were to command upon yourself the comparatively slight operation which, in a more extended form, you so wisely meditate with regard to your future princess." "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed the queen louder than before, and the king and the minister joined in the laugh also. Harelip growled, and for a few moments the others continued to express their enjoyment at his discomfort. The queen was the only one Curdie could see with any distinctness. She sat sideways to him, and the light of the fire shone full upon her face. He could not consider her pretty or handsome. Her nose was certainly very broad, and her eyes, instead of being horizontal, were set up like 2 perpendicular eggs, one on the broad and the other on the small end. Her mouth was no bigger than a small buttonhole until she laughed, when it stretched from ear to ear, only to be sure her ears were very nearly in the middle of her cheeks. Anxious to hear everything they might say, Curdie ventured to slide down a smooth part of the rock just under him to a projection below. But whether he wasn't careful enough or the projection gave way, down he came with a rush on the floor of the cavern, bringing with him a great rumbling shower of stones. The goblins jumped from their seats in anger, but when they saw Curdie with his pick in his hand, their rage was mingled with fear, for they took him for the first of an invasion of miners. The king drew himself up to his full height of 4 feet, spread himself out to his full breadth of 3.5 feet, for he was the handsomest and squarest of all the goblins. He strutted up to Curdie and planted himself with outspread feet right before him and said with dignity, "Pray, what right have you in my palace?" "The right of necessity, your majesty," answered Curdie. "I lost my way and did not know where I was wandering to." "Well, how did you get in?" he said. "By a hole in the mountain," Curdie said. "But you're a miner. Look at your pickaxe." Curdie did look at it, answering, I came upon it lying on the ground a little way from here. I tumbled over some wild beasts who were playing with it. Look, your majesty." And Curdie showed him how he was scratched and bitten. The king was pleased to find him behave more politely than he expected from what his people had told him concerning the miners. But he attributed it to the power of his own presence, and he did not feel friendly to the intruder at all. "You will oblige me by walking out of my dominions at once," said the king. "With pleasure, if your majesty will give me a guide," said Curdie. "I'll give you 1,000, said the king. He uttered a strange shout, half halloo, half roar, and in rushed goblins till the cave was swarming with them. He said something to the first of them which Curdie could not hear, and it was passed from one to the other till in a moment the farthest in the crowd had evidently heard and understood it. They began to gather around Curdie in a way he did not like, and he retreated towards the wall. "Stand back," said Curdie, grasping his pickaxe tighter by his knee. They only grinned and pressed closer. Curdie began to make up a rhyme. 10, 20, 30, you're also very dirty. 20, 30, 40, you're also thick and snorty. 30, 40, 50, you're also puff and snifty. 40, 50, 60, beast and man so mixty. 50, 60, 70, mixty, maxty, leventy. 60, 70, 80, all your cheeks so slaty. 70, 80, 90, all your hands so flinty. 80, 90, 100, altogether dundred. The goblins fell back a little when he began and made horrible grimaces all through the rhyme, as if eating something so disagreeable that it set their teeth on edge and gave them the creeps. Whether it was that most of the rhyming words were not words at all, or whether it was that the presence of the king and the queen gave them courage, I cannot tell. But the moment the rhyme was over, they crowded on him again, and out shot 100 long arms with a multitude of thick, fingernailless fingers at the end of them, to lay hold upon him. Then Curdie heaved up his axe, but being as gentle as he was courageous, and not wishing to kill any of them, he turned the end, which was square and blunt like a hammer, and with that came down a great blow on the head of the goblin nearest him. The goblin only gave a horrible cry and sprung at Curdie's throat. Curdie, however, drew back in time, and just at that critical moment remembered the vulnerable part of the goblin body. He made a sudden rush at the king and stamped with all his might on his majesty's feet. The king gave a most unkingly howl and almost fell into the fire. Curdie then rushed into the crowd, stamping right and left. The goblins drew back, howling on every side as he approached, but they were so crowded that few of those he attacked could escape his feet. They were tumbling over each other in heaps in their eagerness to rush from the cave, when a new assailant suddenly faced Curdie, the queen. With flaming eyes and expanded nostrils, her hair standing half up from her head, she rushed at Curdie. She trusted in her shoes, for they're of granite. That's hard rock, hollowed like French sabots, whatever that is, sabots. Curdie would have endured much rather than hurt a woman, even if she was a goblin. But here was an affair of life and death. Forgetting her shoes, he made a great stamp on one of her feet, but she instantly returned the stamp, causing him frightful pain and almost disabling him. His only chance would have been to attack the granite shoes with his pickaxe, but before he could think of that, she had caught him up in her arms and was rushing with him across the cave. And here she is, ugly. There's the queen, ugly, and there's Curdie. And she had gathered him up, and there's her granite shoes. She dashed him into a hole in the wall with a force that almost stunned him, but although he could not move, he was not too far gone to hear her great cry and the rush of multitudes of soft feet, followed by the sounds of something heaved up against the rock. After that came a multitudinous patter of stones falling near him. The last had not ceased when he grew very faint, for his head had been badly cut, and at last he fell unconscious. When he came to himself, there was perfect silence around him and utter darkness, but for the merest glimmer in one tiny little spot. He crawled to it and found that the goblins had heaved a slab against the mouth of the hole, past the edge of which a poor little gleam found its way from the fire. He could not move it one hairbreadth, for they had piled a great heap of stones against it. He crawled back to where he had been lying in the faint hope of finding his pickaxe. But after a vain search, he was at last compelled to acknowledge himself in a very evil plight. He sat down and tried to think, but soon fell fast asleep. He must have slept for a very long time, for when he woke, he felt wonderfully restored. He felt wonderfully restored, indeed almost well, and very hungry. There were voices in the outer cave. Once more it was night, for the goblins slept during the day and went about their affairs during the night. Curdie listened and soon found that they were talking of him. "How long will it take?" asked Harelip. "Not many days, I should think," answered the king. "They are poor, feeble creatures, those sun people, and they want to always be eating. We can go for a week at a time without food, and all the better for it. But I've been told they eat 2 or 3 times every day. Can you believe it?" "If I may be allowed a word," interposed the queen, "and I think I ought to have some voice in the matter." "The wretch is entirely at your disposal, my spouse," interrupted the king. "He is your property. You have caught him yourself. We should never have done it." The queen laughed. She seemed in far better humor than the night before. "I was about to say that it does seem a pity to waste so much fresh meat." It's a long chapter. "By the time he is starved, there will hardly be a picking upon his bones." The king gave a great laugh. "Well, my spouse, you may have him when you like," he said. "I don't fancy him for my part. I'm pretty sure he's tough eating. For me to eat him would be to honor instead of punish his insolence," returned the queen. "But why should our poor creatures be deprived of so much nourishment? Our little dogs and cats and pigs and small bears would enjoy him very much." "You are the best, you are the best of housekeepers, my lovely queen," said her husband. "Let it be so by all means. Let us have our people in and get him out and kill him at once. He deserves it. The mischief he might have brought upon us, now that he had penetrated so far as our most secret citadel, is incalculable. Or rather, let us tie him hand and foot and have the pleasure of seeing him torn to pieces by full torchlight in the great hall." "Better and better," cried the queen and prince together, both of them clapping their hands. And the prince made a smacking noise with his lips, as if he intended to join in the feast as well. "But," added the queen, "he's so very troublesome. For poor creatures as they are, there is something about those sun people that is very troublesome. I cannot imagine how it is that with such superior strength and skill and understanding as ours, we permit them to exist at all. Why don't we destroy them entirely, use their cattle and grazing lands at our pleasure? Of course, we don't want to live in their horrid country, but we might use it as a sort of outhouse, and even keep their great cows and other creatures, and then we should have a few more luxuries, such as cream and cheese." "Well, it's worth thinking of," said the king, "and you have a positive genius for conquest, but still, as you say, there's something very troublesome about them. It would be better, as I understand you to suggest, that we should starve him for a day or 2 first, so that he may be a little less frisky when we take him out. Once there was a goblin living in a hole. Busy he was cobbling a shoe without a sole. By came a birdie. "Goblin, what do you do?" "Cobble at a sturdy upper leather shoe." "What's the good of that, sir?" said the little bird. "Why, it's very pat, sir, plain without a word. Where 'tis all a hole, sir, never can be holes. Why should their shoes have soles, sir, when they've got no soles?" "What's that horrible noise?" cried the queen, shuddering from pot metal head to granite shoes. "I declare," said the king with solemn indignation, "it's the sun creature in the hole." "You stop that disgusting noise," cried the crown prince valiantly, getting up and standing in front of the heap of stones, and his face toward Curdie's prison. "Do it now, or I'll break your head." "Break away," shouted Curdie, and began singing again. "Once there was a goblin living in a hole." "I really cannot bear it," said the queen. If I could only get at his horrid toes with my slippers again." Granite slippers, huh? "I think we'd better go to bed," said the king. Curdie began singing again. "Go to bed, goblin, do. Help the queen take off her shoe. If you do, it will disclose a horrid set of sprouting toes." "What a lie!" roared the queen in a rage. "By the way, that reminds me," said the king, "that for as long as we've been married, I've never seen your feet, queen. I think you might take off your shoes when you go to bed. They positively hurt me sometimes." "I will do as I like," retorted the queen sulkily. "You ought to do as your own hubby wishes you," said the king. "I will not," said the queen. "Then I insist upon it," said the king. Apparently his majesty approached the queen for the purpose of following the advice given by Curdie, for the latter heard a scuffle and then a great roar from the king. "Now will you be quiet then?" said the queen wickedly. "Oh, yes, yes, my queen. I only meant to coax you." "Hands off," cried the queen triumphantly. "I'm going to bed. You may come when you like, but as long as I am queen, I will sleep in my shoes. It is my royal privilege. Harelip, go to bed." "I'm going," said Harelip sleepily. "So am I," said the king. "Come along then," said the queen, "and mind you are good, or I'll—" "Oh, no, 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 no," screamed the king in the most supplicating of tones. Curdie heard only a muttered reply in the distance, and then the cave was quite still. They had left the fire burning, and the light came through brighter than before. Curdie thought it was time to try again if anything could be done. But he found he could not even get a finger through the chink between the slab and the rock. He gave a great rush with his shoulder against the slab, but it yielded no more than if it had been part of the rock. All he could do was sit down and think again. By and by he came to the resolution to pretend to be dying in the hope they might take him out before his strength was too much exhausted to let him have a chance. Then if he could but find his axe again, he would have no fear of them. And if it were not for the queen's horrid shoes, he would have no fear at all. Meantime, until they should come again at night, there was nothing for him to do but forge new rhymes, for now they were now his only weapons. And that's the end of chapter 10.